For today's class, we're going to do a one-day set of quick notes on chapter 19. So the objective is that you'll be able to differentiate between taxonomy, classification, and systematic biology, construct levels of Linnaean classification hierarchy, and interpret evolutionary relationships depicted in phylogeny. So I'm going to ask that you write down these 3 questions initially in your notebook, and then you're going to be prepared to answer them by the end of today's short notes set. So number 1 is, how are the study of macroevolution and systematic biology interrelated? So how are they related to each other? Number 2, why is it important to classify biodiversity? And why is evolutionary history important to this classification? Number 3, what is phylogeny? What does it represent? And what can one tell you about the history of life on Earth? So pause and go ahead and write these 3 questions down in your notebook with a little bit of space underneath to answer them. All right, so we are going to do our notes on taxonomy today, and then you're going to start your chapter 19 Learn Smart and Summary. That's going to be due on Friday. I will give you time on Thursday in order to finish it though. So the field of taxonomy is the branch of systematic biology that organizes biodiversity into related categories using names. So the names of organisms show kind of how they're related to each other, right? They all have scientific names that show kind of the most specific groupings that they belong to. And it helps organize biodiversity because we want to know who is related to who in order to know what the evolutionary history was, if they came from common ancestors that were recent, or if they came from common ancestors that were way, way, way far back in the evolutionary history. Some vocab is that a taxon is a general name for a group of organisms that have a set of shared characteristics. So if they have similar characteristics, type over here. If they have similar characteristics, then they'll probably be in the same taxon, but there are different levels of taxons, right? There's really broad ones like kingdoms, and then there's really specific ones like species. So if they have somewhat of a similar set of characteristics, they're probably going to be in a smaller group together that's more specific. And if they only have a couple general ones that are similar to each other, they'll probably be in a broader category like kingdom or phylum. Classification is the process of naming and putting organisms into taxons. So it's the act of putting organisms into groups based on these characteristics. A taxonomist obviously is a scientist that studies taxonomy and aims to classify all living things into natural groups. Again, these natural groups are based on characteristics that these organisms have. And phylogeny is going to be an evolutionary family tree that shows the history of taxa. So it shows over time what has changed, when the species developed, what their common ancestor is to each other, all those linkages. Now, looking at these images on the left, we have a giraffe, we have some sort of tree, we have an elephant, zebra, we have a gazelle, we have a person, we have a stork, a lion, a warthog, a hyena, a water buffalo, and an ostrich. Now, if you had to classify these organisms on the left into 2 separate taxons or 2 groups, what would they be? What would those groups be? And who would belong to which taxon, right? You can pick any sort of characteristics that you want to group them by, but make sure you're just clear and explain it in your notes. So Linnaean taxonomy is where binomial nomenclature came from. So that's where every species has a unique 2-part Latin name, and that's what we generally call the scientific name. The first word of each name is always going to be the genus, and it's always capitalized, and the second word is going to be the species, and it's always lowercase. The whole name is always written in italics, so when you see it in like scientific papers or in articles or in labs even, you'll notice the name it stands out a little bit because it's italics. It usually gives clues to the characteristics of an organism. The name is kind of interesting. It either tells about like a color or a shape or a specific characteristic, or even a location that the organism is found, where it's named after, or a person that it's named after. Scientific communication kind of makes it easy for scientists across all countries to talk about the same species, so they don't get confused, because each language has a different common name, right? We call this organism right here a horse, but the scientific name used across the entire world is Equus cabeus, right? And then, for example, here is a lily, and we call it a lily, but obviously in other languages, like in Spanish or in Japanese, they call it different things, but the scientific name is universal and all countries use it. So this would be Lilium longiflorum. Linnaean classification hierarchy, I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there are levels of specificity. So it goes from broad to most specific, from kingdom to phylum to class, order, family, genus, and species. And obviously species is the most specific. That's why it's called species, right? Species specific. And kingdom is very broad. Kingdoms each contain a huge amount of organisms, but a species only contains one type of organism. So you get more and more specific as you go down. Technically, there is another category known as domain that's higher than a kingdom, and we'll discuss that on a following slide. So when two organisms, for example, are in the same domain, they all have general traits that are in common with each other. For example, like eukaryotes, right? A lion and a jellyfish are both eukaryotes. However, structurally, they're very, very different, but they both have cells that have nuclei, and they both have cells that have cell membrane, and they have compartmentalized organelles that are bound by membranes, right? So that's a very general characteristic of all eukaryotes. So they're in the same domain. But when organisms are in the same species, they'll have extremely specific traits in common. So two lions obviously are very, very similar because apart from just the small genetic differences that make them from different families, they all have like the 4 legs, a tail, they're both felines, they have sharp teeth, they eat meat. All those things are very, very similar. So those are specific traits. This system allows scientists to organize life even with how diverse it is. It is now very, very standardized. The rules are pretty much set after 250 years of developing the rules for nomenclature, which is a naming system. And it's kind of cool because it's very useful now for grouping and categorizing organisms, whether or not they're being discovered or they're going extinct and we won't be able to reference them anymore. So like I mentioned earlier, there are 3 domains that are above the kingdoms. So the kingdoms that we talk about generally belong across these 3 domains as well, but 3 domains are going to be over here, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And as you can see, bacteria are unicellular, they have membranes, they have cell walls, they have no nucleus, they do not have membrane-bound organelles, they do have ribosomes to make proteins, but they also don't have any introns. On the other hand, archaea are kind of similar to bacteria, except for the fact that they have different membrane lipids, right? And then also the material that cell walls are made of in archaea are slightly different from the cell wall material in bacteria. And then there's introns in archaea genetics, but the rest is pretty similar, except for the fact that the main difference we can easily identify them by is that bacteria tend to live in normal environments or environments that normal animals are found in. But archaea live in extreme environments like volcanic vents or at the bottom of the ocean, right? So places where normal life forms would really, really suffer and probably not be able to survive in the first place. But they're both unicellular and they both reproduce asexually. On the other hand, the 3rd domain is eukarya. And the thing is that eukarya are very different from bacteria and archaea, but we're actually more similar in structure and function to archaea than we are to bacteria. And I say we because we as humans belong to eukarya. So eukarya include some unicellular organisms like protists and many, many multicellular organisms like fungi, plants, animals, right? And then we have phospholipid bilayer membranes. And then some have cell walls like plants and fungi, but animals don't. And then we have nuclei, we have membrane-bound organelles, we have ribosomes, and we have introns. So this is how we structurally are different from archaea and bacteria in our general 3 domain categories. Now, again, these are very general things that we're talking about, right? We're talking at the basics of cell structure. The reason why when we go to kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, it gets more and more specific is because we're going to more specific characteristics in a structure of an overall organism rather than just at the cellular level. So for phylogenetic trees, they're constructed based on traits that are unique to and shared by a taxon in their common ancestor. So each branch you see in the tree will represent descending from a common ancestor or going through time as developing through evolution. The development of a new trait causes the evolutionary path to split and produce a new branch of phylogeny. And so that's basically like speciation. The ancestral traits or the traits from far back aren't that useful for explaining evolutionary relationships between species because they're a trait that is existing in the ancestor and then is still passed on to the current species that exist. So all of them still in the same taxon have that same trait. So we're not going to be able to tell them differently apart from each other if we're just focusing on that one ancestral trait. The important part is the derived trait because the older common ancestor doesn't have it. So it's a more recently developed trait throughout time. And it is the trait that makes the taxons separate into even more branches because some have this trait and some don't have this trait. So it'll be able to place a species on a separate lineage from another group that even though they both came from the same common ancestor. So to better explain that, let me show you a video. Share sound.
Well, hi there. Got some big news. Lions are not tigers, but they are both cats. They're both big cats, and if you breed them together, they can produce offspring, ligers and tigons. So it probably won't come as any big shock to learn that lions and tigers share common ancestors. If I were to show this as a diagram, I might draw something like this. In this case, I can see that today I have two distinct organisms, lions and tigers. But if I follow the lines back in time long enough, I will run into a point where the two lines intersect. This point of intersection is called a node, and it represents the last common ancestor of both lions and tigers. To be clear, this likely wasn't a lion or a tiger. It also wasn't a single animal or a pair of animals, but a population whose descendants include both lions and tigers. This population, at this point in time, was the last time that lions and tigers shared common ancestors before their two lineages went their separate ways. This could have happened because part of the population became physically isolated from the rest, or because some of them made choices, like which mates they picked, to isolate themselves genetically from the rest of the population. Either way, this population, that was previously a single population, became, after this point, represented by the node, two separate populations. And this diagram, called a phylogeny, visually represents my hypothesis that these two species alive today are related and share common ancestors. Like any hypothesis, this one makes predictions. For example, I would predict that if lions and tigers share common ancestors, they should have considerable genetic and anatomical similarities. I would also make many predictions about fossils that could be found to show steps in the transition between their common ancestors and modern lions and tigers. The phylogeny itself is a hypothesis, a model, that would explain the evolutionary relationship between these two organisms. However, a phylogeny showing the relationships between only two species is not that interesting. This is like a family tree depicting the relationship between two people. We can be pretty confident that they're related, so somewhere they share common ancestors, but that's about all that it says. It doesn't get interesting until we add in a third person. Timmy and Wanda are both humans, and of the two people here, Timmy's closest relative is Wanda, well, other than Timmy himself. They also share ancestors. Cool! But the story doesn't get interesting until I add in Spencer. Timmy, Wanda, and Spencer are all humans. As such, they all share ancestors. But the two that share ancestors more recently will be more closely related to one another than they are to anybody else. For example, if Timmy and Wanda are siblings, then they share parents. And if Spencer also shares ancestors with them, but 10 generations back, then Timmy and Wanda will be more closely related to one another than they are to Spencer. Also worth noticing is that Spencer is no more closely related to Timmy than he is to Wanda. He's equally related to both of them because he shares the same ancestors with both of them. Also, if I flip the way that I drew the diagram so that Timmy is on the top and Wanda on the bottom, that doesn't change the story at all. If I flip it so that Spencer is on the very top instead of the very bottom, that also changes nothing. Their position on the diagram doesn't mean anything. All that matters is how recently they shared ancestors with the other individuals on the tree. If I add in a new person, Janet, and find out that she goes here on the diagram, What I know is that Janet shares ancestors more recently with Timmy and Wanda than she does with Spencer. But Spencer is equally related to Janet, Timmy, and Wanda because the last ancestors that he shares with any of them, he shares with all of them. This is exactly the same way that our phylogenetic trees work. Yes, lions and tigers share common ancestors. But what happens if I add in a leopard, a cheetah, and a grizzly bear? Which one is the closest relative to the tiger? This is where we need to remember what we discussed with the family tree. There are a million wrong ways to interpret a phylogenetic tree, and only one is the right way. So when I'm trying to answer the question, which is the closest living relative to the tiger, I need to remember the one right way. Even phylogenetics graduate students often make mistakes with this because the more you know about these diagrams, the more wrong ways you can come up with to interpret them. The only right way is to identify the last time that tigers share common ancestors with any other living group on this phylogeny. And everything else that shares those ancestors with the tiger are equally related to the tiger and the closest living relatives to the tiger. In this case, the last time that tigers share ancestors with any other living organisms on this phylogeny was at this node. It shared those ancestors with both lions and leopards. Therefore, lions and leopards are both the closest living relatives to the tiger. Remember, when the ancestors of tigers split off from the ancestors of leopards and lions, there was no difference between the ancestors of leopards and the ancestors of lions. They were the same thing. So one of them is not more closely related to tigers than the other. Leopards and lions are more closely related to one another than they are to tigers, because they share more recent common ancestors with one another than they do with tigers. But they are both equally related to tigers. And now you know. But to make sure that you understand how to interpret phylogenetic trees, I have a couple of questions for you to answer down in the comments. Please feel free to ask questions and to help one another with these questions as well. So first, looking at our phylogeny of lions, tigers, leopards, cheetahs, and grizzly bears, what are the closest living relatives on this phylogeny to cheetahs? Second, if I would be to flip all of these nodes, resulting in this phylogeny, does it depict the same hypothesis about the relationships between these organisms, or a different hypothesis? Again, please answer in the comments, and let's make sure we've all got this. If you've learned something today, please like this video. If you'd like to learn more about this topic and other topics in the future, please subscribe and click the little bell. And we hope to see you real soon.
All right, so I am going to ask that you go ahead and try to answer this question. As it loads. So which of these species is the closest living relative to cheetahs? You're going to analyze this and make sure you're looking for the most recent common ancestor. If your answer has multiple organisms, you can still be correct, so don't be worried about that. And then the next question would be,
Picked the same hypothesis?
if I change the order of the organisms on this phylogenetic tree, what does that say about the phylogeny? Is this the same thing or is it different? You're just looking for where the nodes are and what they're explaining. So you're going to answer those two questions. And then we are going to go back to our note set for 2 more slides. So cladistics can be used to organize species derived using derived characteristics. So derived characteristics, like I said, are not the ancestral traits. They're only the traits that are new and popping up that make species different from each other. So for example, like if I were to talk about hooves, right, they're not going to be the derived trait in this case. That would be an ancestral trait because the common ancestor of all deer, all horses, all cows and things all have hooves, right? So we wouldn't be using them to separate things out because every single currently living organism like that has that ancestor has that characteristic. We would be using characteristics that make them different from each other. So one would be like producing milk in excess. One would be having antlers. One would be having horns, right? The traits that make them different are the derived characteristics. So as each trait is introduced, one or more groups is going to be dropped out at a time until all species are separated onto different branches in a cladogram. So the easiest way to look at it and think about it is that when you mark the X's on similarities between, traits and similarities between groups, as they drop off one by one, that's how you would do the same thing as when you're creating a cladogram. Now, a cladogram is just, again, different from a phylogenetic tree because you're not talking about ancestral traits. You're only talking about derived traits. So as you can see here, every single time you have a branch, one group is dropped off, not multiple, one group is dropped off based on that difference on that new derived trait. So for example, there is one common ancestor for all of these organisms. And you're saying, hey, miss, these organisms are really different. And I know. And they're really different because they have a lot of different derived traits from each other. So for example, if we jump to this first branch and we have vertebrae or non-vertebrae, then we would have a lancelet that doesn't have a backbone, and all of the rest of them will have a backbone. So we dropped out the lancelet group, right? The next branch would be 4 limbs or less than 4 limbs, or no limbs, right? And so we would have 4 limbs, and all of these organisms from here up have 4 limbs, and this one group that got dropped off is the tuna, and it does not have 4 limbs. Next would be an amniotic egg, or an egg with the fluid surrounding it, usually as a protection and some nutrient barrier. And so all of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 have amniotic eggs. However, the frog does not, so it gets dropped out. The next one, we're going to be inserting a lot more derived traits. So one side is hair or mammary glands, and the other one is epidermal scales, right? So these ones do not have hair or mammary glands. And then we're also saying that they have epidermal scales, or they have scales on their outside. Now, whether or not they have a gizzard drops out the lizard. And then lastly, whether or not they have feathers drops the finch and the crocodile into 2 separate lines. Versus over here, after you said these 2 have mammary glands, you want to separate them. So one of them has long canine teeth like the dog, and then one of them has an enlarged brain like the chimpanzee. And at the very end, these organisms are all on their own branch, and they're all on the same line on the side here because they all exist concurrently right now as species on Earth. So now we should be able to go from the start of the lesson and answer these questions. Okay, you don't have to rewrite them. You're just going to go back to the beginning and answer them for me. So number 1, how are the study of macroevolution and systematic biology interrelated? Here's some definitions of those 2. Number 2, why is it important to classify biodiversity, and why is evolutionary history important in this classification? And then 3, what is phylogeny? What does it represent, and what can one tell you about the history of life on Earth? If you need to, the video was super helpful, so I will also leave that as a link in this post in case you want to watch it on your own and watch it back to get some clarification.